Hey everyone, we're excited to invite you to join us on Patreon. By supporting us, you'll be helping us keep the podcast going and make it possible for us to continue sharing Black radical ideas and history. On Patreon, you'll get exclusive access to reading episodes, where we break down important texts as well as early access to our guest interviews. Your support also helps us create more educational resources, like a website that will include educational modules about our episode topics and potential live streams. If you want to learn more and support the podcast, visit patreon.com/the Dugout Pod. Every contribution makes a difference.
Hello, and welcome to the Dugout. Thank you so much for staying tuned into this long mini-series we have going on, letting y'all know some things we think you should check into this Black History Month. We started off strong with some good political definitions, got a little loosey-goosey, and now we're back to the studying room. We're here to be like, what is the state again? What is the... Huh?
I think this will be a good episode, once again, for anyone that just kind of wants to have a space to question some of the basics. I feel like I've learned a lot so far in this series, and I think the idea of the state, of authority, of a hierarchy of authority in terms of the ways that we live our lives is really important to kind of unpack. And especially as a Black person, authority, white supremacy, colonization, all of these things kind of go hand in hand for me. So I think it's good to kind of reassess, redefine, and contextualize how we think about authority, which to me, it's like the state, authority, they're both kind of synonymous, but I think there are ways that we can talk about later in this episode about different kinds of state structures, ones that aren't as based in capitalistic kind of super hierarchical state violence and fucking class sort of distinctions kind of way of thinking about the state. So I'm excited to dig in, and I think maybe the first question that we want to explore in this episode is, what is the state? What is the state? And I kind of have broken down this section into, first we're going to explore some kind of commonly known definitions out there from radicals, different Black thinkers, and then kind of digging into how we kind of define the state. And so to start, in researching this episode, I was digging a little bit into Max Weber, who's a German sociologist who wrote a lot in the early 20th century, and how his famous lecture, Politics as a Vocation, defined the modern state in terms of its monopoly on violence. And immediately when I was reading this, I was like, oh, this kind of aligns with how I view the state in a lot of ways. And to kind of share, Weber argued that the state is defined by its ability to claim the exclusive right to use or sanction physical force within a given territory. This does not mean that all states are violent all the time, but that they maintain ultimate control over lawful coercion through police, military, and legal systems. And I think, of course, you could put there unlawful coercion, and then legitimacy as obedience is another like key signifier of this text. So Weber sees state power relies on the belief in its legitimacy. He outlined the three types of authority that justify state rule: traditional, meaning monarchy, inherited rule; charismatic, strong leaders like revolutionaries or prophets; and legal-rational, modern bureaucratic governance, and how the modern state relies on legal, rational authority. And there's a lot of ways that this can relate to Blackness. I think Weber's theory honestly makes me think a lot about like Afro-pessimism in a lot of ways, or like how Afro-pessimism kind of talks about how Black people exist at the intersection of, one, just ourselves being beings, human beings, like, versus the kind of defining of ourselves through death via white supremacy, and how it's interesting, like, you can't be a citizen without the existence of state violence in a lot of ways. And I think even just looking at it from that standpoint, it's interesting because, like, can a state exist without violence? Can a state exist without coercion? I think are some of the central questions that this kind of brings up in my mind, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on Weber in particular, or some of the ways that he talks about the state.
I feel like it's definitely influential to my understandings of what a state was, and like how to think about it as not just the government, not just our society. The more focusing on like what does the state actually do to the individual, kind of their work tracing how the entity of the state has become this rigid being that is not flexible to like the actual individual political will or even new forming collective political wills, especially in relation to how states develop, how the governments that we currently know develop, and how they manage their territory, like come from these imperial violence. The physical force and violence of our current states is kind of baked into their founding logic. So is like their rigidity. Like, I always also see states as like a centralized power being or a centralized polity. And yeah, I feel like in a black politic, I don't know, I feel like we were asked this earlier of like what makes black anarchism black, or some of the relations between what would be like classical European anarchism. And I feel like it's that rejection of the authority that is enforcing the laws through violence and coercion. And anarchists have been doing that, black folks have been doing that, and they've been doing it in that rejection. They still look towards a different kinds of governing. And in that rejection, we find a history of class solidarity, of different land relations and property relations, whether that be like during Reconstruction or in Maroon societies. Like the way people organize their governance can be completely different. I think that's one thing about Zapatistas is if you're a foreigner and you go there, you go to the language school because they want you to learn how semantically and like through syntax, owning things, talking about things, and our relationship to things is completely different. And the relationship to governing is a radical and revolutionary understanding that takes away and completely separates the state versus society versus the governance. And what they fight for is, I think, and specifically Zapatistas, the best translation is good government or good work to sustain life. And the word government itself doesn't mean the same thing as when Weber's talking about politics as a vocation. Like, they're talking about people creating this whole class structure and system to maintain a status quo, maintain certain material conditions that within their own territory are beneficial for them.
And I want to dig into some more black perspectives next, like on a historical and a contemporary level. But I do also think it's good to kind of think about the state in terms of like, what are the functions of the state and then what are the tools of the state? And if I think of like a function or functions of the state, I think the state is there to determine what our laws are, what the status quo is that we operate under. The state is there to operate and control the resources that we all need to live and survive, whether that be water, air, earth, whatever the fuck. And then from those functions, we can kind of look at what are the tools that are necessary to make those functions happen. So we think about, like, from Weber's perspective, force and violence, the police, or that the state uses the police, the military, security services to keep people in check. We can also think about how the state forms our literal status quo, so making the rules. The government makes the laws that tell people what they can and can't do. And what do we know as well about the elite? They can break whatever the fucking laws they want as long as they pay enough money. What does George Jackson say? There are no billionaires on death row. And then another kind of tool of the state is controlling money and resources, so they control our literal conception of money, the labor practices that our bosses get to utilize to exploit us, and other important resources. And then I think even in a more interesting way is that the state also controls what people hear and see, what we learn in the schools, what kind of stories are told in the media. I even think now, like, one of the things that angers me about Trump being in office again is just how the media literally, for the most part, can't just say, like, he's probably a Nazi. And then another tool of the state, of course, which we've talked about in various ways in the podcast, and I think we'll definitely dig into more when we talk more about security culture down the line, is surveillance and monitoring. So the state watches people closely through things like cameras, the internet, your phone in your pocket, spying on conversations, even producing a paranoia that gets us to snitch on each other, which is something that I think is important to think about. To turn away from that and more towards text that I think is really centering, if we want to think about what the state is, I want to read a little bit from Anarchism and the Black Revolution by Lorenzo Camboa Irvin, who, of course, his lovely partner, Jodina, was on the podcast. But I really like this definition because, of course, you can read any old German, European, whatever the fuck. But what do black people say? What have we said? And this is from a section of it titled Capitalism, the State, and Private Property. And it reads, "The existence of the state and capitalism is rationalized by their apologists as being a necessary evil due to the alleged inability of the greater part of the population to run their own affairs and those of society, as well as being their protection against crime and police. Anarchists realize that, quite in the contrary, the principal barriers to a free society are state and the institution of private property. It is the state which causes war, police repression, and other forms of violence, and it is private property, the lack of equal distribution of major social wealth, which causes crime and deprivation. But what is the state? The state is a political abstraction, a hierarchical institution by which a privileged elite strive to dominate the vast majority of people. The state's mechanisms include a group of institutions containing legislative assemblies, the civil service bureaucracy, military and police forces, the judiciary and prisons, and the subcentral state apparatus. The government is the administrative vehicle to run the state. The purpose of this specific set of institutions, which are the expression of authority in capitalist societies and so-called socialist states, is the maintenance and extension of domination over the common people by a privileged class. The rich in capitalist societies, the so-called Communist Party, and state socialist or communist societies like the former Union, a Soviet Socialist Republic.
However, the state itself is always an elitist position structure between the rules and the ruled orders, givers and order takers, the economic haves and have-nots. The state's elite is not just the rich and the super rich, but also the person who assumes state positions of authority, politicians and judicial officials. Thus, the state bureaucracy itself, in terms of its relation to ideological property, can become an elite class in its own right. This administrative elite class of the state is developed not just through dispensing of privileges by the economic elite, but by the separation of private and public life, the family unit and the civil society respectively, and by the opposition between the individual family and the larger society. It is sheer opportunism, brought by a capitalist competition and alienation. It is a breeding ground for agents of the state. The existence of the state and a ruling classes based on the exploitation and oppression of the working class is inseparable. Domination and exploitation go hand in hand, and in fact this oppression is not possible without force and violent authority. This is why anarchist communists argue that any attempt to use state power as a means of establishing a free, egalitarian society can only be self-defeating, because the habits of commanding and exploiting become an ends in themselves. This was proven by the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution in 1917 to 21. The fact that the, quote, communist state accumulated political power much as the capitalist class accumulated economic wealth. Those who govern form a distinct group whose only interest is the retention of political control by any means at their disposal. But the institution of capitalist property, moreover, permits a minority of the population to control and regulate access to and use all of the socially produced wealth and natural resources. You have to pay for the land, water, and the fresh air to some giant utility company, or often real estate firm. And I love that contextualization of it, because I feel like always putting it in this framework of the state is not what's going to save us, and trying to replicate the state is not what's going to save us. And especially thinking about how when we organize for something, if we organize like the state, and like honestly a lot of anarchists are realizing and have been realizing, if you organize like a political party, you're trying to grab power and control power instead of disseminate and distribute power. You want to keep the velocity of power within an upper crust hand. This is like the issue with super centralized and hierarchical vanguardist party. Like somebody's got to lead, but you don't always have to be the leader, and they always have to be the led. Revolution on behalf or revolution with. The people who are leading, it always has this separate interests are going to be developed by the leading class, by the leading folks. And they're going to try to maintain their own identity. They're going to try to maintain their own social and cultural norms that they're going to create in this process. And that's going to be different from the quote unquote masses, or even trying to purport to be for the masses without actually organizing a federation of masses, of voluntary groups of folks who come together and realize that we need to do something differently when we govern. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like that hits something on the head for me. Yeah, what does that make you think of?
I like Lorenzo's kind of breakdown of, I especially love this, like maybe the third paragraph we read where he talks about the elitist position structure behind the rules and the ruled order givers and order takers, and how so much of it is both about like this elite class within the state that, it says this administrative elite class of the state is developed not just through dispensing privileges by the economic elite, but as well by the separation of private and public life, the family unit and civil society. So I just think it's interesting that he draws these dichotomies that I think help us understand our positionalities in relation to authority, and how authority can look like the economic elite, the elite that are a part of the government, other kind of folks in society that institute rules or maintain this kind of state-derived status quo. And so I think it's a really useful explanation, especially like with the lens of Blackness in mind. We have been forced into to be a part of this colonized like land and state, and how so much of that is literally based in an authority that reifies itself again and again and again and again and again and again. And so I think it's interesting, I guess, thinking of all these things in mind. What is your definition of the state, and how has it changed over time? Is it changing now because our state is changing, to put it lightly? I don't know. But what do you think of your own definition in relation to like your past, how it's shifted over time, what's happening now? What's your definition of the state?
And some people may see this as a contradiction, but to me, the state and the government are two separate things. The state administers government and governing energy. Not literally energy, but policy, and things like that. I've always seen the state as an instrument of controlling an administrative process, and it's more been a centralized authority. And there's always been that term of like, oh, it's always like the monopoly on violence or the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, and that's something that is like socially, like de facto, or like understood, is that it's legitimate. Like that definition to me has always been iffy, because I'm like, what do you mean it has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence? And it's more of like, what's a monopoly on what people think that is? And then I think when people see the breakdown of that reality and noting that there are other legitimate uses of violence, and that I think when that breaks down, they see the state as not the only thing that can do that, which makes that whole definition to me break down. Which is why I don't know. I feel like it's something I struggle with, which is like, as an anarchist, should I struggle with defining a state as much as I do, as like a singleized polity? Or I think it's also something that has so many different definitions too. And I feel like once I get in anarchist circles, it's weird. I find like I have a more rigid definition of a state than I do in other places. Because I'm like, if you just Google what a state is, it does talk about the monopoly on violence, and then how it comes out of different constructs of governing, from like the city state to then there's the states that are considered union states, which is like our federal government, versus like our city versus our state or province. And all those different things can be called states, and they're just like governing apparatus and administrations and ways to administer policy. And I think I like how anarchists antagonize the definition of what is a state and what is governing over and over again, to the point where it kind of breaks down what the fuck it is. Because even with like Trump is like, we need to get rid of the deep state. And by that, like, they're going on like these anti-Semitic cabal of the elitists entrenched in the bureaucracy of our government, actually controlling all the strings. And the bureaucracy is only like this way so that it can actually be controlled from the top. And it's like, actually, no, I know this is just a beautiful fucked up cacophony of a machine of human interests. And each human and state actor is just a human being. I think maybe this is where I get to closer to what I would call a definition of the state, which is that more miasmic political force or entity or cultural mindset around governing, that comes from a history of governing through control and through trying to control fauna, to your partner's bodies, to how the world works. Because a lot of human civilization and what we have considered progress is some sort of human domination or some sort of indomitable spirit. Yeah, and that's my rant about the fucking state. Read Abdullah Öcalan.
I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, I don't know. With questions like this, I like to break it down into sub-questions. Like, someone's like, what is the state? What is your definition? I'm like, shut the fuck up. The follow-up question for me is more like, because I think, what is the state? It's almost so large of a concept that unless you're like really theoretically or ideologically tied and you're reading from an encyclopedia, I feel like that's where I'm like, the question can almost be like a temp check for some people, which I think feels kind of weird. And I think the follow-up question I have is like, if I'm going to define the state, one, I think of like kind of back to what I was saying before, like the functions and tools, and like how I see it now. Like I think as the state is there to define the borders that confines that state. It needs systems and tools to define and assert those borders. I think states are concerned typically with economics and profit. And so there's this whole idea and mythology around what kind of country are we? What do we produce? How do we make profit? And so I think there's that element as well, which is seems really, really important. If I bring it back to like what I resonate with both in what Weber is defining and Lorenzo, like I like that Weber defines the state through the process of it legitimizing its own violence, which is why I'm really into Afro-pessimism and understanding the state through its capacity for violence, which is why last year I made that the U.S. is fascist video, because I think the U.S. both has innovated like how a state can be seen and how it can manifest and change over time. And I think it also is clearly defined by its capacity for violence. And I don't think all states are mainly defined by their capacity for violence. But like Weber says, it's like it depends on the state. And so I think that's like a very clear thing under capitalism. Like you need fucking violence to protect property and to protect like an idea of patriotism or whatever. And then what I like about what Lorenzo says is he goes more into like the systems that make this violence possible and the intersectional impacts of it, which I think is like some of my critiques of like people that are like just reading the European shit when we're in the US context. Cause I'm like, how is the state operated specifically for black people? How has that involved redlining? How has that involved segregation? How has that involved literally state sanctioned violence that then became like extrajudicial violence or both, as we've been seeing it all throughout the history of this country? And so just to kind of like spitball some things that kind of give us ideas of other ways of organizing on a like community and a state level, we can look at the autonomous administration of North and East Syria, which I know you added to the note. Different ideas around like what can get us to a more liberated state structure, like direct democracies where decisions are made at the commune level through assemblies. But I don't know, did you want to speak a little bit to this?
One of the big parts that when looking to how do we change our governing part, and I think that in the Anarcata statement, which is a black anarchist tradition, I feel like they get on this point too of defining the state through its violence, and especially through its main functions, which is economic control, which is why a lot of people, when they think about, like, this is something you hear from all different kinds of people, like our government shouldn't be a welfare state, our government shouldn't be taking care of people or doing this or that. We all have these very different and growing conceptions of what our government should be doing. And folks who want to think about it as like this big state or this state that just is there to protect our monetary and property interests. Like that's what people would say when they want like your small government. They want the smaller government so that they can only protect property. And I think a lot of what understanding the insidiousness of the state and how it functions is black folks were property. The state there to manage property relations, and especially in the U.S. and how the U.S. has innovated itself and with its needs, its flesh-based fucking dispossession, it was about codifying and codifying how black bodies as property could exist and relate as not only personal but economic, spiritual beings. And that's something to distort and upend when thinking about stateless futures, or when thinking about different ways of governing, grassroots alternatives. And like you mentioned, the autonomous administration in Northeast Syria is a great project to look at for what they're doing, because they're trying to do this like direct democracy at the commune level, focusing on gender liberation, ethnic and cultural pluralism, and creating voluntary associations around that, making sure that they're at the commune level, which is like a bunch of neighborhoods, and then the commune is federated upwards. And there's been issues with that, and there have been lots of different critiques and critical support coming from on the ground, and different ways to think about this. But I think when looking at alternative models, even like the autonomous administration and the Zapatistas, is these folks are fighting guerrilla wars. These folks are fighting wars while also trying to build this alternative economic system, and understanding how to protect the interests of a more directly democratic society as well as economy It's something that I feel like we have a lot of work to do with making that education more accessible. And I feel like looking at those decolonial experiments, because they try to reimagine what governing and what statehood is and what it's like. Again, these are just mini introduction episodes. Please go do more and more of your research. We will be putting some of that information in the show notes to extend the knowledge, because that's the point of this. Stay safe, stay dangerous.
Our podcast is a tool for learning, and we're taking it further on Patreon. By supporting us, you'll gain access to exclusive reading episodes where we unpack key texts and ideas, plus early access to interviews with radicals and revolutionaries. Your contribution helps to make these resources more accessible and impactful. Visit patreon.com/thedugoutpod to support our work.